with me after the fact. I'll provide my contact information at the end. If you are following me on Twitter, you'll see that I have some pre-timed tweets that are going out as we move through this content. So that's a nice little instructional technique to add. Again, I'm just going to kind of plow through here real quick so that we can get caught up on time. Like I said, I've distilled much of what I've learned down into 8 tips, and these are the ones I want to share with you in the time we have today. So rather than read to you, I'd like to give you a chance to see what I've written, and if you have any additional things that you'd like to talk about or tips that you think are valuable for this team or this group to learn from, please type in the questions panel. And I'm going to stop and mute myself and catch my breath and read what you've been typing in the questions panel. If you like what you see here as far as the 8 tips and you're ready to move on, again, show hand raise by clicking that button that hangs off the control panel on that skinny little grab tab toolbar. Great, I see your hand raises showing, and I'm not seeing any additional items, so I assume these 8 tips are things that you want to learn about, so I'm going to keep moving forward. Before we get too deeply into content, I'd like to invite you to give me some feedback on how attentive, how much participation you'd like to give me during this. So I'll ask my producer to show the poll and give you a chance to vote. So if you would please, let me know, are you agreeing to participate with me? Like, of course, yes, absolutely, I've carved out time for this today. Or kind of, your voice is really white noise in the background, but I'm, half listening, and that's fine. Or let me know you're not able to participate. Maybe you're manning a phone that keeps ringing. I get it. I understand. You're a grown-up. You get to choose to participate how much you want. But I've designed this session to be interactive, so I need for you to interact with me. Otherwise, it'll just be a session of chirping crickets. So please be willing to play along by doing what you're doing right now, voting on this poll. A little later on, I'll ask you to type more in the questions panel. So I see 88% of you have voted. If you have not yet voted, please click to the left of your response, even if it's just a sarcastic, snide response, and then click Submit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and I'll share the results with you. You can see that, we have a mixed group of people here, and that's totally understandable. The reason I do this is so many of us have been trained throughout our experiences with webinars that webinars are something you do while you're doing something else. And there's very little expectation that you're actually going to participate. So if you'd like to create a webinar that participants participate in, I find it helpful to not only design for participation, but get agreement up front. Because if you're all gung-ho and nobody else is with you, it's a lonely ride. So consider using a technique like this one, inviting people to agree to participate, but don't punish them if they choose not to. If they do happen to need to multitask, that's their choice. There's only so much you can do to compel participation. So I'd like to start with another activity that has you really looking at the features of this software interface. Now, you may have used other software tools, GoToWebinar, Adobe Connect, Skype. Different features reside in those different tools. So I'd like you to focus on what you're seeing here in GoToWebinar. Oops, hold on just a second. Could you close the poll for me or hide the poll? I think we're still showing the poll. Can you just hide that? Hold on.
Yep, it's hidden on our screen, Karen. Are
Okay.
you able to see presenter?
I'm still seeing it in my audience view window, but if you can see that I've moved on to the activity slide, that's good. Are you seeing my activity slide?
It's showing the poll. Just 1 second. It just says it's closed, but it does say that it's showing the.
I'm just going to try restarting sharing.
Perfect. We can see it now.
Oh, okay, great. So it's just a little hung up there. Remember, we are all at the mercy of the internet right now. There's only so many things we can do to ensure that technology flows in both directions uniformly at all times. So I'd like to stop here and just have you think about the features that you're seeing within this software interface. There might be some limitations that you notice or some cool things that you think are special in this software interface, and I'd like you to brainstorm that and let me know what features you're seeing right now. Okay, so I see your responses coming in the questions panel. Yeah, there's chat, but notice chat here doesn't work the same way it works in other environments. We're using the questions panel. Chat is really for the presenter to speak to the organizers or the presenter to talk one-on-one with the participant. And yeah, there's polls. Of course, you're seeing the activity slide now, right? So we're able to application share PowerPoint and show slides. You're able to raise hands and so forth. So it's helpful to consider what resources are going to be available in the interface that you're using so that you can design appropriately. And it's important to be cautious to not just use every feature just for the sake of using every feature, but also not to lock yourself down to just really a simplistic design style. I think sometimes we look at virtual classrooms as just glorified conference calls, and I'm challenging you to take it beyond that, to take it into more of an instructor-led, learner-focused, dynamic exchange between participants that allow people to really come together and have a valuable live experience. If all you're doing is talking and talking, you know, all it is a broadcast of a presentation and there is no designed interaction. My question is, why bother to do it live? Why make everybody log in and jump through hoops to be at a particular place and time? Why not just record it and let them play the recording back later? So there's something to be said about the dynamic exchanges that we want to have and we want to create in these virtual classroom environments. But they don't just happen automatically. A couple of years ago, one of our leaders in the industry, Dr. Ruth Clark, looked through how virtual classroom tools were being used, especially, and also other e-learning like asynchronous, self-paced e-learning. And she came to this conclusion. I'll give you a chance to read this. Let me know by showing hand raise when you're finished. Good, okay, I see your hands being raised, so it looks like you're starting to wrap up, but essentially she's saying it kind of doesn't matter what tool that you're using, it matters that you leverage the tool so that you can have interaction. And if you think, you know, back in the caveman days, they were using sticks and dirt, and when I was in school, they were using blackboards and chalk. I mean, it's not the interface that's the issue, it's the how we use it. We also can't blame the software for stopping us to be interactive. If you say the virtual classroom limits my ability to interact with my participants and the physical classroom facilitated that, it really isn't the classroom that's at fault, it's how we use it. So I encourage you to look for opportunities to engage with learners by doing things like we're doing here, asking questions, getting them to respond, a combination of different activities that have people pulling their attention away from their inboxes and their Facebook status to come and have a conversation here live. That's what's compelling. So I would say, some things to consider is design for the resources that you have available. If you're in Adobe Connect, you're going to have a lot of different, maybe kind of complicated ways to set up your instructional design or your interactions. But here in GoToWebinar, these are the things that we use. And in fact, one of the ones that you see here is transfer of files. I have provided 2 handouts with this session. If you'd like to download them, you can go to the transfer files or the handout panel on the right to access those or download those files. But you see us in the background using these things where I'm application sharing PowerPoint. We struggled with handing over controls to change the presenter earlier. Sometimes we use chat to communicate behind the scenes. Earlier we used a poll. We're using hand raise, and I have not yet, but I may use the arrow pointer tool to get your attention on screen. So these are the resources that I should design for and consider. But I don't want to force it. I don't want to just use, let's say, breakout groups because the software I have allows for it. And let me just say, GoToWebinar doesn't. If you want breakout rooms in this line of product, you would need the GoToTraining product to do that. So consider how you will engage with participants and get them to give you feedback, confirm with you that they're out there and they're learning and they're listening as opposed to being distracted. But don't feel like everything you have to do is a dog and pony show, that it's up to you to manage everybody's attention. It's really up to you to continue to be an invitation to encourage people to participate. So when you're designing for the available resources, consider that instead of doing verbal introductions that might take a long time, you might instead do like a text-based introduction. And hold on just a second. So in today's session, I had you type your introductions into the questions panel so you could see who was in the session and I could get to know who's in my audience. Instead of showing webcams, which can be technically challenging, we can use this little thumbnail photo technique, which if you look at the attendees list and at the staff page, you can see my name, and next to me is a tiny, tiny, tiny little picture of me with that green turtleneck on. So rather than say, okay, we need to put a lot of emphasis around seeing people live, which can really drag people's network connections down when they're not only broadcasting video, but receiving live streaming video from multiple sources. That can cause people's networks to crash. So you might choose not to make that the emphasis, but use this sort of pared down version. And instead of using breakout groups, you might use something like a paired text, where people are private chatting with each other to have the same type of activity or outcome. So I'm just going to pause there and take a breath and let you read this next slide. So in my many moons as a trainer and in my many days in a classroom, I've found that one of the most effective ways that I can create participation is by asking a really good question, one that's clear, one that makes it clear how I want the participants to respond, and one that really draws the attention in and helps me move the conversation to the next step. So rather than saying, hey, I assume you are all trainers and you all have 5 years experience with GoToWebinar, I might say, here's a poll. What is your job role? Here's a different poll. How many years experience do you have using this tool? So by asking the question, I'm not making assumptions. I'm getting real feedback in real time. So my challenge to you is to look at your own content and look at those places within the content where your trainer might already naturally be asking a compelling question. And every time you're making an assumption about who people are or what they know, stop and turn it into a question. So remember at the beginning of this session, I asked you 2 questions. If you remember what they were, please go ahead and type in the questions panel now. Great. Yeah, I see Stephen's response there, where we are and our role in webinars. Right. Wendy says the same, where I'm from and what I'll be doing with webinars. So it's a little rapport building icebreaker right at the very beginning, not content relevant, but certainly group relevant. So I can understand if you're more on the trainer side of things or more on the design side of things and which things you're going to be most concerned with. But by not asking questions, I'm just guessing. I have no real idea of what you need. So the other thing I would recommend is as you're designing and as you're preparing to deliver an online event, really get real about how long things take. There's positives and negatives to the physical version of an activity and the virtual version of an activity. If I am in a physical classroom and I ask for a round-robin introductions, how many minutes do you think it's going to take me for each of those participants to tell me their name and where they're from? How much time does that take from my session time to do that round-robin introduction? Go ahead and type in the questions panel the number of minutes per person it takes to do an introduction. Yeah, Morgan, you're right. 1 to 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, Sharon. It depends. It gets longer and longer and longer as you go around the circle, though. Yeah, Barbara, way too long. People drone too much. So I can burn a lot of time. Well, I don't want to say I don't care about my participants. I certainly do, but I can't afford that amount of time. So I use a different technique. I have them type in chat instead or type in the questions panel in our case here. But look at how things shift in the virtual classroom, where things that took a different amount of time in the physical classroom take a different amount of time in the virtual classroom. So something as simple as turn to your neighbor and brainstorm 3 solutions to this problem. Well, that's a piece of cake in the physical classroom. Turn to your neighbor takes what, a nanosecond? Unless you have to move furniture. But turn to your neighbor in a virtual classroom requires instructions on how you use the virtual classroom subgroups, instructions on the activity that's going to be done in the subgroups, because once they're in the subgroups, it's hard to communicate with them. You know, you really need to take a ton of time to do something that seemed simple before. So I would say really play out the scenario. How much time does it really take to do this? How much instruction are they going to need? And how much time will they need to do the exercise? And I think you'll find that that alone shifts the weight of your content away from how it looked in the physical classroom. Now, some people, especially stakeholders, will say, but I like it the other way. And what you need to say is, everybody liked it the other way, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we try to shoehorn the old way into the new model. And if you've been delivering online for a while, I bet you know that already. You've seen that if you just try to upload your PowerPoints and just work off of that, it just doesn't fly in the virtual classroom. If you agree with that, if you've had that experience, can you show hand raise and let me know, yeah, just shoehorning the old content into the new model does not work. People don't participate. Trainers think it's a nightmare. If you agree, show hand raise. Okay, great. I see a bunch of nurses, and Barbara Waxer and her team are responding. Jane Morris, hi Jane, and Jody and Ken Andrews, Sharon and Stephen and Suzanne, Wendy, thanks you guys. Yeah, oh, I agree. Resistance is the name of the game here, but it's a whole new world. We're working with different resources, and resources that your participants might have had bad experiences with in previous events where, you know, they were bullied into participation, or the software was such a nightmare that they couldn't even pay any attention to the objectives. So these are the things that we need to overcome and try to give webinars and virtual classroom sessions a better name in our environment. But you don't just wing it, you know, you don't just show up and wing it and it works. In fact, you have to be really explicit about things, right down to the words you use. So if in the physical classroom I used to say things like, let me demonstrate, I now need to say things that feel a little awkward, like, please see your screen change as I start sharing my view. Well, nobody rolls out of bed saying that. It's awkward, it takes some getting used to, and your trainer could use a little help from you, the instructional designer or editor, to give them the words they need to communicate in this environment. So if in the physical classroom you used to just say something simple like choose this or this, give me a show of hands if this is the case. Okay, now show your hand if, or raise your hand if this. Well, here we're using polling, which means you need to say awkward things like, please respond to the poll you see on your screen. Click submit. Does your trainer know to say that, or are they still struggling with things like words that don't make sense anymore in this environment? And instead of just share your own example, you have to be explicit about how you want people to participate. Because they're thinking, is this one of those like type in chat questions or type in the questions panel, which is awkward? Or is this going to be a poll, like am I waiting for something to pop up? Or are you going to like unmute me? Like they have no idea how you expect them to participate unless you tell them how. Also, one of my favorite things to have people do in a virtual session is say, let's brainstorm. Brainstorm all the things you know about GoToWebinar, all the features, all the tools, all the resources that you can use. Well, brainstorm in and of itself is ambiguous, but if I say type your responses in the questions panel, it's unambiguous. And ambiguity is the enemy of the clear virtual online session. In the presence of ambiguity, participants do nothing. So if you want them to do something, be clear about what it is that you want them to do. And be clear that the question that you're asking them is also not ambiguous. If I were to say to somebody, hey, explore this website on your own, they might say, what website? What do you mean this? So I need to say, click the posted link to access the site. Tell them what to do and where they're going. And what you've heard me doing is having you use hand raise, because that's one of the few features I have in here for what we would call a binary poll. Binary poll is yes or no, and I use it all the time. Can you hear me? Yes or no. Are you seeing my slide? Yes or no. If I just say, can you hear me? You might be answering, but your microphone isn't open, so it doesn't do me any good that you're answering. I need to tell you exactly how to answer, and yes, I love this slide too, and it took me some time to put this together because a lot of my script is ingrained now. But when I'm working as an instructional designer, I know I need to give these words and this language to my trainer and my producer because they just don't have it. The other thing is to really work under the assumption that everything will go wrong all the time. Your paranoia is a good thing. If you think virtual classroom sessions are a problem because the technology fails, you are 100% correct. So, if you're smart about it, you'll assume that things will go wrong all the time, and you will prepare by having Plan B and Plan C in place. Now, you might have noticed in my session today, this was not a setup, but it is the reality of my life, that when I joined initially, my telephony audio inexplicably stopped working. I was logged in for several minutes before. We talked, it worked, but when it came time for the rubber to meet the road, whatever was going on caused my phone to not work. Had I not already had my headset plugged into the USB port in my machine, let's say it was still in my bag from yesterday, or worse, still in the blister pack that I bought it in, I haven't cut open yet, how long would you have waited for me to get audio back again? And how many numbers do I have to dial to get back in on the phone? That takes time. So be ready for Plan B to be implemented right now. If you say, we're going to move to a different number, what's that number? How are you going to get it to your audience members? So you might log in with 2 computers. You might have one computer on your Ethernet connection and one computer on your MiFi connection. In case one fails, the other one will be available. And you might have 2 different audio options. So in case one fails, the other one is the option. I would say this is one of my #1 tips, because if you're going into this thinking Winger is going to do it for you, I promise you it won't. And that's 18 years experience. It doesn't get better. It is consistently inconsistent. So let your paranoia drive you, and then you can relax, believe it or not. Once you have things in place, you know that Plan A is backed up by Plan B. And I've gone so far as to implementing Plan D, and I was glad to have it. So when you start thinking about what kind of contingencies, Karen, what do you mean things can go wrong? These are the things that can go wrong. And it's important for you as a producer, as the person who's running the event behind the scenes to prepare and appropriately make the participants prepare. If people are coming in at the last minute and they have no idea, they don't have an internet connection, they don't know what a browser is, you're likely to have all kinds of user errors. So get your participants prepared ahead of time. Have your trainers prepare ahead of time so you know exactly what's going to be happening and they have their machines and their software installed properly. But also assume the worst will happen and you will have to troubleshoot in the moment. You can see here my solve column gives you plenty of solutions. I can't promise that these solutions are going to solve every problem, but if you come across something, by all means, write it down and incorporate the prepare items into your pre-session checklist so that things are taken care of. And do not rest on your laurels. Just because it worked last time, that has no bearing on next time. You need to prepare each time thoroughly and completely. Or you might be left with some catastrophic failure that is unrecoverable. And in 18 years, I've had that happen about twice. Barbara, I can't really answer that for GoToWebinar. My preference is not to use video through this interface. If I want participants to see a video, I'll post it out on the web someplace and give them a link. I find that streaming media through a streaming media tool is really just one of those things that overburdens people's bandwidth and reduces the quality of the output. If I just say go to YouTube and play it, then they can deal with it without the bottleneck that is GoToWebinar. So take a look at this, and I'd love to hear your feedback. Which of these scenarios looks familiar to you? And I'm going to stop and drink my water for a second. Right, yeah, and that happened to me too. And it probably in that case was just an interruption in the internet connection. So when you're real-time sharing, like you have to do here all the time in GoToWebinar, any fluctuation in your network connection can cause the display to disappear. My preference is to use a software tool like WebEx or Adobe Connect that the PowerPoint is uploaded into the interface, and that is living on an Adobe server on some server farm someplace. So if my connection fails momentarily, it's very unlikely that also your connection would fail and also the Adobe server connection would fail. So I find that just this one is even more challenging to manage bandwidth than the others. Okay, thanks so much for your responses there. So I'm going to keep moving through. And, you know, this one is an interesting one. I think the trainers that I've been observing lately seem to want to skip over the objectives of the session or the learning points of the session. And it reminds me back in the day when I worked in a training center when we were doing Microsoft training every day. We had 16 classrooms that seated 16 students, and we were cranking them through. So, you know, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, Harvard Graphics, Multimate, WordPerfect, networking, all kinds of different classes. And people would show up at our sign-in desk and say, hi, I'm here for Microsoft. We're like, yeah, no kidding. No, really, no kidding. They have no idea what they're there for. How well are you going to learn when you have no environment, no understanding of what you're even there to learn or what the purpose of it is? So if you can start your content, your sessions, your webinar with objectives, helping people see what the big picture is and where we're headed, and maybe even some information about the timing on that. And then allow them to see that progress throughout, whether it's slip sheets between sections, or maybe your content is literally chunked like in an e-learning course where you would do one objective and then that piece ends. And then you do another objective and then that piece ends. I mean, that way participants can consume the content very easily and in short bursts, but they're not sort of lost in the overwhelming sea of content. So keep that learning plan in sight so people know where they are in the process. They see that the end is near and that they are able to keep following along and keep focused. Keeping that in mind, when you are the instructional designer, you might find that designing for the virtual classroom feels like juggling bags of water or something. You know, everything is so unwieldy and pieces are here and there and everywhere, and you've got stuff that you've got to upload and stuff that you've got to live share and stuff that you've got to put on the LMS and stuff that goes in the handout for download, and there's just all these elements everywhere. And again, it reminds me of the good old days when my books sat on my desk in my cubicle. And what I did when I went to training was I took my books and my acetates and my floppy disks and I carried them to my classroom. So now we're dealing with things that are just all over the place. And when it comes to design, it can be hard to follow along, especially if you, the instructional designer, are handing off to a trainer. You might not be able to communicate all those disparate pieces and how they fit together. So I find when I'm designing, it's helpful for me to look at my content in more of almost an inventory, where I'm seeing the pieces that say, what are we getting at here? And what's important to have put in place before we go here? And is this going to be one of those video things, or is it a hand raise thing, or is it a type in chat thing? And if it is that, what do I have to set up ahead of time? Like one of the features here in GoToWebinar actually disables participants' use of hand raise. And in some tools, chat needs to be enabled so participants can see what the others type in chat. So to be able to really pin this down into specific items helps you to see what's missing. And for me, I can go back to a storyboard like this and just see the giant holes where there are no interactions. There's no question being asked. There's no activity. There's nothing that's going to compel participation. It's turning into just a show up and throw up or chalk and talk style session. And I think if that's what your session is turning into, maybe that's exactly what you need. Maybe not the throwing up part, but it's just the content. Make it a TED Talk. Make it a 20-minute lecture that a participant can consume on the treadmill at the gym if he wants to. But why are we logging in together to be live if we're not interacting with each other? So for me, interaction is one of the most important things. And here, I'm really overly scripting it. I'm saying this is what the trainer will ask, and the wording of this question should generate these answers, so I know that it's worded well. And I can't assume that they're just going to verbally blurt out answers, so I need to be really specific that they're going to use chat or a poll or a green check mark or red X or something like that. And if it fails, what would I do to punt? If the poll doesn't work for some reason, maybe I forgot to create it, can I punt by just saying, oh, okay, type your responses in chat? Oh, plan B, built right in. But it's crucial not only to the design of the training, but to the preparation of the trainer to know what those questions are. Because for a trainer, it can be hard to come up with those things on the fly. If you're a fantastic trainer and you're 100% confident with this content, it's probably a lot easier, which means I would bring in trainers as your subject matter experts to ask them, where does it make sense to ask questions here? Even if they're simply, do you agree with what I just said? Or are you ready to move on? Or do you have anything to contribute to this at this point? If you ask the question, any questions? I'm sorry, that's not a question. That says, I'm moving on. I really don't care what you think. A question like, what questions do you have? Or what have you learned in this section? That's a relevant wrap-up kind of question. But any questions just means, I'm turning the page now. Last chance. And it doesn't ever sound authentic. So the last item I had on my tips plan was to challenge you to rethink your handout. In recent years, since I feel that courseware has sort of gone away, where the production of a workbook is less economically viable and also more awkward to ship to virtual students, we've gotten to the point where we want to really simplify the materials that get handed over to the participant. They don't need all the photos, they don't need the file to be 30 megabytes in size. They just need a tool that will allow them to review the content, well, let's say follow along with the content as they're learning through the session, and then reference back later on when they are trying to remember one of the key things they learned in that session. So take a look at the handout that I provided for you and notice it's very, very simple. It has some really simple language that I want you to be able to review, and it has some places where I'm kind of challenging you to fill in the blanks. And either it's fill in the blanks with the example that I gave that might be meaningful for you, or fill in the blanks with your own ideas that are more meaningful for you. But it's not as canned or prescribed as maybe just a set of PowerPoints with speaker notes associated with it. It's more activity sheet based. So I'm curious to know, are you using anything like this as a handout, or maybe my better question is, what does your handout look like these days? Great, I see Brian's response there. Workbook similar to this, yep. Slides, Sharon. Yeah, me too. It's so easy just to go from the slides to the handout, but the problem I find is the trainers want all the words on the slide so it can be their script, and then that becomes just a read-along, and then we give that PowerPoint to the participants, and now they've got the script and the slides and start saying things like, why do we need the training? Or why do we need it to be live? And maybe that's a good question. Maybe you just need the trainer to talk through the slides and post those slides on SlideShare. You know, maybe it doesn't need to be live. Kathleen is saying they don't use handouts. Okay, that's understandable. Some of our handouts have been similar to Classroom, and some have been in more detail, expecting to have the interaction to be online, right, Stephen? The problem is we forget. You know, once the interaction is over, then if there's no takeaway, you're relying on the fact that the participants maybe picked up a pencil while they were in the session and wrote some keywords down. You know, probably not. Maybe if they're very, very disciplined learners. So just started using Clarify to make refreshers as job aids. Wendy, that sounds great. And Clarify helps make good-looking how-to docs. Excellent. Brian says, and or single or double page additional or supplemental resource. It could be an example of how to do something that was referenced in the web event. Yeah. I need a takeaway. I like to take notes on the handout to learn. Yeah, me too, Sharon. So one of the things of GoToWebinar is you're not seeing these things that I'm typing in. There is a way for me to have you see it, and that is if I respond and send the response to all, then you can see what the other participants have said. But when I'm talking and teaching, it's hard for me to type. So often I'll have someone behind the scenes who's kind of doing that facilitation to help that flow of communication continue smoothly as I stay focused on the words I'm saying. As a trainer, I will say that is one of the most challenging things. If I'm reading and talking at the same time, I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. I get easily confused and say the wrong words. Somebody just said to me the other day, she meant to say client, but accidentally the word coupon came out. It's like, I don't know why the brain does that to us, but we have a hard time multitasking with words when we're seeing and talking at the same time. So I have many more things that I would love to say on this topic, and certainly if you'd like to talk to me more about it, give me a call. I'll provide my contact information at the end. I am doing a couple of events coming up at eLearning Guild Conference in Orlando in the spring, in March. But before we wind down this session, I'd like for you to verbalize or type in chat some things that you saw me use in this session. If you'd like to speak up, you can raise your hand, and I'll unmute you, and that will give you access to a microphone to control your audio. Getting a message that the handouts are not downloading. Okay. I'm going to ask my team to take a closer look at that. It's possible, Sarah, if you're on a wireless network connection, that it's just choking on that. And I heard from somebody else that they were able to download. So I would say, again, if you want to speak up, show hand raise, and I'll give you a chance to speak. But in just a minute, I'm going to clear those hands and suggest that we use hand raise to let me know if you got the handout. So Kathleen, would you like to speak up? Show hand raise again if you do. think that was from earlier. I like the fact that if we're all using text-based messaging, that I have an easier time managing the session duration. Once I open the audio to allow participants to type, it's much, much harder for me to control the amount of talking. So it does take some pretty masterful skills on your trainer's part to encourage people to type or to speak up verbally. So if you're going to include that, if that's important to your design, I would say make sure you allow enough time for people to do things like hassle around with getting their microphone working or hassle around with getting their volume adjusted. These things are surprisingly time consuming, especially when we're used to just blurting out anytime we want. Okay, a couple more people are having a problem with the download. So I'm going to say reach out to me afterwards. If you were not able to get the handout, you can contact me at my email address and I'll drop that into chat in just a minute. So I see some tips coming back, maybe not too many. Hang on a second. Okay, more than one person is having problems. So I'm not seeing too many answers to my question. What tips did you see me use in this session? So if you would indulge me, it might be beneficial to brainstorm on what things were actually at work while we moved through this content today. Plan for contingencies, yes. Hopefully I didn't lose my cool or drop any F-bombs or anything like that. Yeah, polling, you liked the idea of using polling and hand raise. Using the available resources, yeah, using what was available here, which in the idea of the questions panel seems really contradictory for a lot of people because we're not talking about questions, we're talking about answers. So it means that we need to not only design a little bit differently, but language a little bit differently. You like the polling and the 60-second brainstorm. Okay, thanks, Wendy. So good. Those are some things I'd like to encourage you to take away with you and apply. Please steal these ideas at will and apply in your own case. And if you prefer to, or if you're willing to, let me know later on how you used what you learned in today's session. But I'm really curious to know what you're going to use to improve your next session. Go ahead and type in the questions. Okay, I see some things coming in. Dawn says the storyboard. Stephen says more work with trainers new to working online. Yeah, a train the trainer can be incredibly valuable to help flatten that otherwise very steep learning curve. You know, everything is, all bets are off really. Everything is just different enough in the virtual classroom to make a confident physical classroom trainer lose their mind. Believe me, I've seen it. It's like everything is wrong. Preparing, how you will prepare and solve issues. Yeah, great, Wendy, and they will arise for sure. Rethinking the handout, thanks, Brian. I like the use of hand raise. I've done many pollings. I also will not ask any questions. Thanks, Sharon, I appreciate that. So good, you like the use, okay, that was from before. So I encourage you to take these things away and talk to your team members about how you can implement these 8 tips. And honestly, in 18 years, these are the things that I find to be the most effective. My job is almost 100% helping people make their web sessions better. And these are the things where you can really change the dynamic of a webinar by just asking more questions. You can really reduce the number of technical problems that happen in a session if you just give people a heads up a little bit ahead of time. You can really help participants feel more confident in where you're headed in this content if you show them along the way where they're headed. So I appreciate your interest in this topic, and I open the floor now to questions. If you have questions for me, please type in chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can speak up. Well, I didn't see you all jumping to ask questions in the questions panel. Oh, although there is one here from Barbara. Do you have a, oh, hold on, it just slipped away. Barbara asks, do you have a preferred activity like poll to give participants when you need to read a bunch of questions that just keep streaming independent of current content? I'm not sure I understand the question, Barbara. Can you clarify? How would I recommend using virtual classrooms with faculty for professional development topics? I would use them kind of in the same way I would use them in a physical classroom environment, but I might break things up into smaller chunks and try to find a time of day that works for people across the time zones and schedules and so forth, and allow people to log in and be contributors in chat, allow them to share their own ideas and give examples. So Wendy, I hope that answered your question. Do you do any presentations like this online and during learning design, such as courses placed in LMS, or just live in virtual learning? I really am a live and virtual learning person. I've been a live trainer for years. I don't do a ton with asynchronous just because there's plenty of people out there doing that. It's not my strength. Okay, I see some more coming in here. Oh, Barbara is clarifying how to handle a jamming chat stream. So the jamming chat stream is an issue, and I think it's part of ground rules to establish that I'm going to ask you questions at certain points, but then there's going to be other points that I'm just ignoring chat, or I don't want you to type in chat. With Adobe Connect, you can take away the chat. So it's actually, I think I could take away the chat right now in this environment as well. So it might mean that you need to limit their ability to communicate that way by physically changing the setting in the software interface. I hope that answers your question, Barbara. She says, okay. We could talk more about it later. Ooh, timed tweets. If you were watching my Twitter handle, I really just synced the 8 tips with 8 tweets. There were 10 tweets total. But the idea is I want you to have a takeaway from this, and I want to have potentially a jumping off point for a further discussion on any one of the 8 tips. So in advance of this session, I established, okay, it's likely that this tip is going to be delivered at 11:33 Central Time, and this one is I'm probably going to be talking about this at about 11:35 Central Time. And so I used TweetDeck to schedule tweets ahead of time. And that allows us to take this conversation beyond the construct of GoToWebinar and take it out into the world. Yeah, I like TweetDeck too. And the other one is Hootsuite. Very handy for timed tweets. So we're just winding down our time here, and I'd certainly like to encourage any or all of you to communicate with me directly if you'd like to. My email address is, believe it or not, Karen@KarenHeider.com, and I do have a website, www.KarenHeider.com, and I just want to share with you a view of where I was last week in lovely Puerto Rico. And this is the Yunque rainforest. So have a serene rest of the day as you enjoy this image. Again, if you have questions for me, stay in chat. I'm happy to answer.
Karen, thank you so much for your time today. I think everybody got a lot out of it, and we want to give you a big thank you and a big hand clap, virtual hand clap.
Thank you. You're very, very welcome.
All right, thank you everyone for attending the webinar. As you close out today, you'll have a survey that pops up. If you do have time to take that, we would appreciate the feedback. And also we will be sending out the recording of this webinar and also those 2 handouts by the end of the week. So thanks everyone again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. I appreciate your help.